Marcus Hayes had always believed that life had a strange way of preparing people for the paths they were destined to walk long before he wore a badge, long before he sat in a detective's office with stacks of files and a ringing phone. He was simply Marcus, the boy who loved solving puzzles, the young man who noticed the details most people overlooked, and the son of a schoolteacher who taught him the value of patience. He grew up in a quiet neighborhood, not rich, not poor, but full of the kind of people who looked out for one another. On summer evenings, kids played ball on the street, and parents leaned against fences to chat about their day. Marcus was usually on the sidelines, watching more than he played, observing how his friends moved, how the ball spun, how arguments started and ended. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy the game, it was that his mind naturally wanted to understand things, to notice the little details that told the bigger story. His mother, a kind woman with a soft voice, often said, "Marcus, you see the world differently. You pay attention. That will take you far." At the time, Marcus didn't fully understand what she meant, but those words stayed with him. As he grew older, those small observations became habits. He noticed when a classmate was upset before they said a word. He noticed when the same car circled their block too many times. He even noticed how the family's old dog seemed to sense moods, wagging his tail when someone was happy and resting his head when someone was sad. Marcus realized that life was filled with small clues, and if you paid attention, you could understand people better. By the time he reached high school, he had developed a calm presence. He wasn't the loudest in the room, nor was he the one chasing attention. Instead, he carried himself with quiet confidence. Teachers trusted him, classmates came to him for advice, and his closest friends admired how he seemed to stay level-headed even when things got complicated. After graduation, Marcus considered different careers. For a time, he thought about teaching like his mother, then he thought about law school. But what kept pulling at his heart was the idea of service, the idea of protecting people, making communities safer, and standing up for those who felt unheard. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that law enforcement might be his path. When he joined the police academy, it was both exciting and challenging. The training was tough, the expectations were high, and every recruit had to prove not just their strength but also their discipline. Marcus quickly stood out, not because he was the fastest runner or the strongest in training, but because of the way he thought. He could analyze situations, remain calm under pressure, and see patterns others often missed. Some instructors noticed and told him, "You've got a detective's mind. Don't lose that." Marcus took their words seriously. His first years as a patrol officer were full of learning. He worked long nights, answered all kinds of calls, and faced the reality that real life on the streets was not like what people saw on television. He saw families in need, young people making mistakes, and situations that could escalate in seconds if not handled carefully. Through it all, Marcus kept his calm approach. He earned respect not just from his supervisors, but also from the community. People remembered the tall, calm officer who listened more than he spoke. They appreciated that he didn't rush to judgment and that he tried to understand before making decisions. Over time, his hard work paid off. Marcus earned a promotion to detective, a role that fit him perfectly. Now he had the chance to dig deeper into cases, to ask questions, to connect dots, and to search for truth. Each file on his desk wasn't just paperwork, it was a story of someone's life, someone waiting for answers. Detective work wasn't glamorous. It was hours of interviews, late nights piecing together evidence, and the patience of waiting for small details to align. But Marcus thrived in it. He didn't mind the slow process, because he knew that every answer mattered. Every solved case meant justice for someone who needed it. In his department, Marcus became known for his integrity. Younger officers often looked up to him, and even seasoned detectives valued his insight. He wasn't boastful, and he never tried to take the spotlight. For Marcus, the reward was simple, knowing he had done his job with honesty. Outside of work, Marcus lived a quiet life. He enjoyed reading, cooking simple meals, and visiting his mother on weekends. He wasn't married yet, though friends often teased him about being married to the job. Marcus would laugh, but deep down, he knew they were right. His dedication often meant late hours and missed social gatherings, but he accepted it. He believed his work had purpose. On one particular afternoon, Marcus wrapped up a case meeting at the precinct. He changed out of his suit and tie, opting for casual clothes before heading home. It had been a long week, filled with back-to-back interviews and reports, and all he wanted was a quiet evening to rest. The city was alive as usual, cars rushing, people moving along sidewalks, the hum of everyday life filling the air. Driving through familiar streets, Marcus let his mind wander. He thought about his next case, about the people depending on answers, and about the steady rhythm of his career. To him, it was just another ordinary day. But ordinary days have a way of turning extraordinary, sometimes in ways a person least expects. Marcus didn't know it then, but the next few minutes would remind him that no matter how many years he wore the badge, no matter how much experience he carried, the world didn't always see him for who he was. Sometimes, it saw only a surface, not the story behind it. And so, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the city streets, Detective Marcus Hayes drove calmly toward home, unaware that the flashing lights about to appear in his rearview mirror would turn a simple drive into a moment he would never forget. The city streets always carried a certain rhythm, a kind of background music made up of car horns, distant voices, and the occasional siren echoing through the air. On that afternoon, Marcus drove with the windows half open, letting in the breeze as he passed familiar corners. He wasn't in a hurry. The day had been long, and he wanted nothing more than to reach home, prepare a simple dinner, and perhaps read a book before resting. But as he approached an intersection, Marcus noticed flashing blue and red lights dancing in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought they were heading somewhere else, but the lights stayed close behind him. He frowned slightly and guided his car to the side of the road. The patrol vehicle stopped directly behind him, lights still spinning. Marcus felt a brief wave of surprise. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a red light. He checked his mirrors again, thinking perhaps there was some mistake. Still, he placed both hands calmly on the steering wheel, a habit learned from years in law enforcement and action meant to keep everything clear and safe. Moments later, a young officer stepped out of the patrol car. His posture was stiff, his expression serious. He adjusted his belt as he walked up slowly, his eyes scanning Marcus's car before leaning slightly toward the window. "Good afternoon," the officer began in a steady but firm voice. "I'm going to need to see your license and registration." Marcus gave a polite nod. "Of course," he replied, keeping his voice even. The officer glanced at him carefully, then continued, "The reason I stopped you is because you match the description of a burglary suspect reported in this area. I'll need you to cooperate while we sort this out." For a brief moment, silence filled the space between them. Marcus looked at the young officer, and though his face remained calm, inside he felt a sting of disbelief. He was dressed in simple clothes, yes, but nothing unusual, just jeans and a jacket. His car was well kept, his driving had been careful. Yet here he was, being told he matched a suspect. Marcus had heard stories like this before. Friends, neighbors, even strangers had shared similar experiences, but he never imagined it would play out this way for him, not after all his years of service. Still, he kept his composure. He slowly reached for his wallet, pulling out his driver's license. As he handed it over, he said gently, "I understand you're doing your job. But I assure you, I'm simply heading home." The officer studied the license, then looked back at Marcus. His tone remained cautious. "We've had a call about someone fitting your description. I'll need to ask you a few questions." From nearby houses, curtains moved slightly. People were noticing the flashing lights outside, and curious eyes peeked through windows. A couple of pedestrians slowed their steps, glancing at the scene as though expecting drama to unfold. Marcus felt the weight of their stares. Inside, a quiet thought echoed in his mind: how quickly appearances can shape perception. The young officer shifted slightly, his stance still guarded. "Where are you coming from today?" he asked. Marcus answered politely. "I was at the precinct earlier. I'm on my way home now." The words hung in the air. The officer gave a small frown, perhaps unsure whether to believe him. After all, to the officer, Marcus looked like an ordinary man in casual clothes, not like someone who spent his days behind a detective's desk. Marcus knew this could go one of two ways. Either the officer would proceed with suspicion, or he would pause to consider the possibility that the man in front of him was more than he seemed. For Marcus, the moment carried more than inconvenience, it carried the reminder that no matter his years of service, there were still moments where the world would not see the detective, only the surface. He kept his tone respectful. "Officer, I understand your concern. But I want you to know, I serve on the force as well." The officer raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing slightly as if measuring the truth of the statement. He didn't speak immediately, perhaps uncertain of how to respond. Around them, the neighborhood seemed unusually quiet. The distant city sounds faded as the focus tightened on this small interaction: one man in his car, another standing by his window, each representing the same institution yet momentarily divided by misunderstanding. Marcus felt a mix of emotions. He wasn't angry. Anger would solve nothing. Instead, he felt the weight of irony. After years of training, after countless cases, after dedicating himself to fairness and truth, here he was, questioned on the side of the road like any other stranger. The young officer shifted again, clearing his throat. "If you don't mind, I'll just need to verify your information before letting you go." Marcus nodded patiently. "Do what you need to do." He leaned back slightly, his hands still resting calmly where they could be seen. The officer returned to his patrol car, likely running checks, leaving Marcus with a few quiet moments to reflect. He gazed out at the setting sun, its warm light softening the edges of the scene. Yet the irony remained sharp. Neighbors continued watching from their windows, their silhouettes faint behind curtains. To them, this was a spectacle, something to whisper about later. But for Marcus, it was another chapter in the story of perception, a reminder that identity is often judged before it is truly seen. When the officer returned, his steps were slower, his expression less certain. He handed the license back with a polite nod. "Everything seems fine," he said, though his tone carried a hint of hesitation. "I appreciate your cooperation." Marcus accepted the license quietly, giving a small nod in return. "No problem," he replied. His voice was calm, but the moment had already etched itself into his memory. As the officer stepped back toward his car, Marcus took a steady breath. The situation wasn't over yet. He knew he still held the small badge inside his jacket, the one that could change the entire conversation in an instant. But he also knew that timing mattered, that sometimes silence spoke just as loudly as words. For now, he remained patient, letting the moment unfold. Because in life, as Marcus had often learned, it was not the loudest voice that carried the truth, but the calm one that waited for the right time to be heard. And though the flashing lights continued to glow against the fading daylight, Marcus knew the true reveal was yet to come. The minutes ticked by slowly, though in reality, only a short time had passed. Marcus sat in his car, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence. He watched the officer walk back to his patrol car, and he could almost read the young man's thoughts from his body language. The officer's stride wasn't as firm now, his shoulders not as squared. It was as though doubt had begun to slip into the certainty he had carried only moments earlier. Marcus leaned back slightly in his seat. Years of detective work had taught him to read people, how a tightened jaw meant tension, how shifting eyes hinted at uncertainty, how silence could sometimes say more than words. Right now, the young officer's movements told Marcus everything. He was no longer entirely sure of the story he had created in his mind when he pulled the car over. Still, the situation carried weight. The flashing lights behind Marcus's vehicle continued to paint the quiet street in sharp colors, drawing attention from anyone nearby. People remained at their windows, curious and cautious, some whispering behind curtains, others simply staring in silence. Marcus could feel their eyes on him. He imagined what they might be thinking. Who is this man being stopped? What did he do? He knew how quickly assumptions formed. A car pulled over, an officer standing outside. It didn't take much for imaginations to run wild. The officer returned after a few moments, standing near the car window again. His voice was a little softer now, though he still tried to maintain an air of authority. "Everything checks out," he said, handing back the documents. "But like I mentioned earlier, you do match a description, so I needed to be sure." Marcus accepted his license and registration, his fingers steady. "I understand," he replied calmly, though inside, he felt the familiar pull of frustration. Not the loud, angry kind, but the quiet frustration of being seen only in part, not in whole. The officer hesitated, as though expecting Marcus to drive off immediately. But Marcus didn't start the engine yet. He sat still, his mind weighing the situation. Should he let it end here? Should he drive away quietly, leaving the officer to reflect on his assumptions in private? Or should he reveal who he truly was, not as a means of pride, but as a way of reminding the young man that appearances often tell only a fraction of the story? He looked at the officer again, his expression calm but firm. The younger man shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. It was clear he felt the imbalance now, though he couldn't quite place why. Marcus finally spoke. "Officer, I appreciate you doing your job. But there's something important you should know." The officer tilted his head slightly, waiting. With deliberate care, Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. His movements were slow, steady, and respectful. From within, he pulled out a black leather badge holder. He flipped it open, revealing the polished detective's badge that gleamed faintly under the evening light. The effect was immediate. The young officer's eyes widened, his mouth opening slightly before he quickly closed it again. The confidence that had colored his voice earlier seemed to vanish, replaced by an awkward silence that hung heavily in the air. For a moment, the only sounds were the faint hum of passing traffic and the distant barking of a dog somewhere down the block. Marcus didn't speak right away. He let the badge rest in plain view, its presence louder than any words could be. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the most powerful response. Finally, the officer cleared his throat. I didn't realize," he said quietly, his tone different now, less sharp, more careful. Marcus gave a small nod, his expression steady. "That's the point, isn't it?" he replied softly. "You didn't realize." The officer's gaze dropped for a second, and when he looked back up, there was no mistaking the unease in his eyes. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly at a loss for how to continue. In the windows of nearby homes, faces lingered. Some of the neighbors, noticing the shift in tone, leaned back into their houses, perhaps realizing the story wasn't what they had imagined. The flashing badge had changed everything in an instant. Marcus closed the holder gently and returned it to his pocket. "We all wear the same badge," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "But before anyone sees that, they see something else first. And that's what we can't forget." The officer nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as though trying to show agreement without fully knowing what to say. His earlier confidence had melted into humility, and though he muttered a short apology, Marcus could see the lesson settling in deeper than words could express. For Marcus, the moment was more than personal. It wasn't just about being mistaken for a suspect. It was about the larger truth he had faced many times before, that identity was often judged by the surface, and only later by substance. He started the engine of his car, the low rumble breaking the silence. Before pulling away, he looked at the young officer one last time. "Be careful with assumptions," he said, not as a scolding, but as guidance. "They can lead you to the wrong conclusion." The officer nodded again, his face thoughtful, almost humbled. Marcus eased his car back onto the road, the flashing lights fading in his rear-view mirror. The neighborhood slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Curtains closed, footsteps moved on, and the quiet hum of the city filled the air once more. But inside Marcus's mind, the scene remained clear. The look of surprise, the silence after the badge was shown, the shift from suspicion to realization, all of it etched itself into memory. It wasn't the first time he had faced such a moment, and he knew it likely wouldn't be the last. Still, each time carried its own weight, its own reminder of the gap between perception and reality. As he drove, he thought about the young officer. Perhaps this experience would shape him, remind him to pause before making judgments in the future. Marcus hoped so. After all, real growth often came from the quiet lessons, the ones that left a mark without needing a lecture. For Marcus, the badge was more than metal and leather. It represented years of dedication, of sleepless nights, of sacrifices made for the sake of others. To reveal it in that moment was not about proving authority, it was about reminding both himself and the young officer that identity is layered, complex, and deserving of patience. The road stretched ahead, lit by the warm glow of street lights beginning to flicker on. Marcus drove steadily, his thoughts lingering on what had just happened. The silence that had followed the reveal of his badge was not empty. It was full of recognition, full of realization, full of the quiet truth that sometimes speaks. Marcus drove slowly through the neighborhood, the sound of the engine soft against the quiet street. The flashing lights were no longer behind him, but the memory of them lingered in his mind. His hands rested steady on the steering wheel, yet his thoughts were far from calm. He had revealed his badge, ended the moment, and moved on, but the weight of what happened remained heavy inside him. He glanced at the sidewalks as he passed. Children rode bicycles near the curb, their laughter echoing in the evening air. A couple carried grocery bags, walking home as the sun dipped lower. Life seemed ordinary again, as if nothing unusual had happened just minutes before. But Marcus knew that for him, and maybe even for the young officer who had stopped him, the moment would not be forgotten so easily. At the next red light, Marcus sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the glow ahead. His thoughts turned inward, reflecting on his years of service. He had faced challenges, long nights of difficult cases, and moments that tested his patience. But this felt different. This was not about solving a mystery or bringing justice to a case. This was about the simple truth of how he was seen before he was truly known. He thought of his mother. She had always reminded him to carry himself with dignity, no matter the circumstance. Her words echoed in his mind, "Marcus, don't let the world decide who you are. You decide that for yourself." And yet, moments like this reminded him how often the world tried to make that decision for him. The light turned green, and he continued driving, the rhythm of the city surrounding him once again. Still, his mind lingered on the young officer. Marcus wondered what the officer was thinking now, sitting alone in his patrol car. Was he embarrassed? Was he reflecting? Would he remember this moment the next time he encountered someone who matched a description? Marcus hoped so. Because sometimes the strongest lessons weren't found in books, or in training sessions, but in real experiences that opened one's eyes. By the time Marcus reached his apartment, the sky had grown darker, painted with shades of purple and gold. He parked his car, sat for a moment, and let the engine's hum fade into silence. The stillness of the night wrapped around him as he stepped out, carrying the quiet weight of the evening with him. Inside his apartment, Marcus placed his keys on the small wooden table by the door. He removed his jacket, draped it neatly over a chair, and sank into the couch. The room was peaceful, yet his mind was still replaying the scene, every word, every look, every pause. He closed his eyes, thinking back to the silence that had fallen when he revealed his badge. It had not been an angry silence, nor a heavy one filled with conflict. It was the kind of silence that carried realization, the moment when understanding finally catches up to assumption. That silence, Marcus knew, spoke louder than anything he could have said in that moment. He leaned back against the cushions, breathing deeply. His badge, resting now in his jacket pocket, felt heavier than usual, as if it carried not just the symbol of his profession but the reminder of what it represented. To Marcus, the badge had always meant service, responsibility, and the duty to protect. But tonight, it had meant something more. It had been a mirror, showing both him and the young officer the gap between appearance and truth. As the night settled, Marcus prepared a simple dinner: grilled chicken, vegetables, and rice. The motions of cooking calmed him, grounding him back in routine. He sat at the small table near his window, eating slowly while watching the city lights twinkle outside. Each light seemed like a story, a life moving forward, unaware of the small drama that had unfolded just hours earlier. Yet Marcus knew the story mattered. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was real. Real in the way it revealed assumptions. Real in the way it reminded him of the world he lived in. Real in the way it asked him, once again, to carry himself with patience even when tested. Later, he picked up a book from his shelf, though his mind wandered too much to focus on the words. He placed it aside, turned off the lamp, and sat in the quiet. The city outside buzzed faintly, but inside his apartment, all was still. He thought about the path he had chosen years ago, the oath he had taken to serve and protect. Nights like this made the oath feel heavier, but also more important. Because it wasn't just about solving crimes or catching suspects. It was also about building bridges, about being an example, about showing others, especially younger officers, that service required more than authority. It required understanding. Marcus knew he couldn't change every perception, nor could he erase every assumption. But he could control how he responded. He could choose patience over anger, dignity over frustration. That, he realized, was its own form of strength. The next morning, as sunlight spilled through his window, Marcus prepared for another day. He dressed in his professional attire, pinned his badge carefully, and stood before the mirror for a brief moment. The man staring back at him was calm, steady, and ready to continue the work he believed in. On his way to the precinct, he thought again of the young officer. Perhaps their paths would cross again. Perhaps the officer would remember the man he stopped, the man who matched a description but turned out to be a fellow detective. And perhaps that memory would remind him to pause, to look closer, and to understand more deeply before making assumptions. Marcus hoped so. Because the lesson wasn't just for the officer. It was for anyone who might one day find themselves standing on either side of such a moment. As he parked at the precinct and stepped into the familiar building, Marcus felt a quiet resolve. What happened the night before could not be undone, but it could shape the way forward. For him, it was another reminder of why patience mattered, why composure mattered, why integrity mattered. And though the world might not always see him for who he truly was at first glance, Marcus knew the truth. He knew the years of service, the dedication, the countless lives touched by his work. And he knew that, no matter what, he would continue to carry himself with the quiet strength that had guided him from the beginning. The silence that had fallen after he revealed his badge still echoed in his memory. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence full of meaning, a silence that had spoken louder than anger, louder than argument, louder than anything else. And as Marcus moved forward into the new day, he carried that silence with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder. A reminder of who he was, of what he stood for, and of the quiet power of patience in a world quick to judge. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that evening stayed with Marcus. He carried it quietly, not as a heavy burden but as a reminder, like a bookmark saved in the pages of his life. He didn't speak much about it to his colleagues. He didn't want to turn it into a story passed around the precinct or a point of gossip. Instead, he allowed it to sit within him, shaping his thoughts in a subtle yet lasting way. Every time he looked at his badge in the mornings, as he pinned it carefully onto his jacket, he remembered that moment when silence had fallen between him and the young officer. That silence was not about victory or authority, it was about awareness. It was about the sudden realization that assumptions can blur the truth. Marcus held onto that, letting it guide the way he carried himself. At the precinct, life went on as usual. Files stacked up, phones rang, and detectives hustled through cases. Marcus continued his work with the same calm dedication he was known for. He interviewed witnesses, followed leads, and pieced together puzzles with steady patience. Yet, in the back of his mind, he often thought of the larger picture, the importance of being seen fully, not partially. He also thought often of the young officer. Marcus didn't know his name, but he hoped that the moment had stayed with him as well. Perhaps it would become a turning point in his career. Perhaps, in the years to come, the officer would treat others with more patience, more thoughtfulness, and more understanding. That, Marcus believed, was how change often began, not with lectures or rules, but with experiences that reached the heart. One evening, while reviewing notes at his desk, Marcus reflected on the people he had served over the years. He remembered the families who had thanked him after long investigations, the neighbors who felt safer after a case was closed, and the younger officers who often came to him for advice. Each of those memories reminded him that his work was more than a profession, it was a legacy in progress. And legacies, he knew, weren't always written in grand gestures. They were written in the everyday choices, choosing patience over anger, dignity over pride, and understanding over assumption. On weekends, Marcus visited his mother, who always welcomed him with warmth and gentle conversation. One Saturday afternoon, as they sat in her kitchen with the smell of fresh bread in the air, she asked him, "Marcus, are you still carrying yourself with peace?" He smiled softly, stirring his tea. "I try to, Mom. Some days are harder than others. But I remember what you always told me about patience. About not letting the world decide who I am." His mother nodded, her eyes full of quiet wisdom. "That's good, son. Because people will always see what they want to see first. But the truth of you will shine through if you stay steady. That's what lasts." Her words settled deeply into Marcus's heart. They reminded him that the silence after he flashed his badge was not only about that one moment, it was about a lifetime of proving, again and again, who he was through his actions. As time passed, Marcus noticed something interesting. Younger officers in the department began approaching him more often, asking for guidance. They valued his calm approach, his ability to defuse tense situations without raising his voice. They admired how he seemed unshaken, even when faced with challenges that rattled others. One rookie officer, after a long shift, asked Marcus directly, "How do you stay so calm when people misjudge you?" Marcus paused, thoughtful. Then he replied, "Because I know who I am. And if I let every assumption change me, I'd lose that truth. You can't control what others see at first glance, but you can control how you respond. That's where your strength is." The young officer nodded slowly, the words sinking in. Marcus knew it might not make sense to him immediately, but one day, in some future moment, those words might echo back when needed most. In the years that followed, Marcus continued to build his quiet legacy. He solved cases, mentored younger officers, and earned respect not because he demanded it but because he lived it. Yet, every time he saw flashing lights in his rearview mirror, even if they were far ahead or on another street, his mind returned to that evening. He remembered the look on the young officer's face when the badge was revealed, the surprise, the realization, the silence. That silence had not been empty. It had been full of meaning, a silent conversation between two men who wore the same symbol but stood in different moments of understanding. For Marcus, that silence became more than memory. It became a lesson. A lesson that assumptions could be dangerous, yes, but also that dignity in response carried a power of its own. A power that didn't shout or demand, but simply stood steady and clear. Years later, when Marcus thought about retiring, he reflected on what he would leave behind. Not awards, not plagues, not statistics. What mattered most were the moments, big and small, when he had chosen patience and integrity. He hoped that those moments lived on in the people he had touched, in the victims who found justice, in the families who found closure, and in the officers who learned from his example. On his final week before retirement, a group of younger officers gathered around him in the break room. One of them, smiling warmly, said, "Detective Hayes, we've all learned something from you: how to stay calm, how to listen, how to respect people. You've left more than a career here. You've left a standard." Marcus felt a quiet pride, the kind that didn't need words. He simply smiled, thanked them, and reminded them, "Carry yourself with dignity. That's what people will remember." When he finally turned in his badge, the weight of it in his hand felt different. It was no longer just a symbol of duty. It was a reminder of the journey he had walked, the lessons he had learned, and the legacy he was leaving behind. As he stepped out of the precinct for the last time, the evening sun cast a warm glow over the city. The world outside moved on, busy and unaware of the quiet milestone he had just crossed. But Marcus knew that somewhere, in the memory of one young officer and perhaps in the hearts of many others, the silence of that long ago evening still echoed. It was the silence that fell after assumptions gave way to truth. The silence that reminded both men that identity is more than what is first seen. The silence that carried respect without words. And as Marcus walked into the new chapter of his life, he carried that silence with him, not as a weight, but